center of your screen. We hope you enjoy today's event. We will begin soon. We hope you enjoy today's event. We will begin soon. We hope you enjoy today's event. We will begin soon. Thank you for joining the National Benevolent Association for today's event. We hope you enjoy today's event. If you are joining us on Zoom, you will be able to view computer-generated closed captions by clicking the CC button at the bottom center of your screen. We hope you enjoy today's event. We will begin soon. Thank you for joining the National Benevolent Association for today's event. We will begin shortly. If you are joining us on Zoom, you will be able to view computer-generated closed captions by clicking the CC button at the bottom center of your screen.
Greetings, friends. Today is the first day of summer in, oh, let's let our first slide go. Let's try that again. Greetings and welcome. Today is June 21st, 2026, and it is the first day of summer. So welcome to Scent Summer 2026. I am Reverend Darnell Fennell, Director of Social Entrepreneurship at the National Benevolent Association, and I'm grateful that you are joining us this evening. Some of you may remember this gathering as Scent Seminar, which was traditionally held in September, but we have reimagined and renamed this experience as Scent Summer, creating space to gather early in the year for learning, connection, and encouragement. During this time, we'll gather with leaders, innovators, and change makers from across the country who are responding to the needs of their community with courage, creativity, and faith. We know this work can both be deeply meaningful and incredibly demanding. Our hope is that in these sessions, we offer fresh ideas, practical tools, and encouragement for the journey ahead. So, again, thank you for being here and for the work you do in the world.
Hello, friends. My name is Reverend Ashley Mayham, and I work alongside Darnell as the Social Entrepreneurship Program Coordinator. We're grateful to have you join us this evening. And as Darnell named, we have pivoted a little bit, but we still hope to bring you a message of encouragement and instruction. And this year's theme for our Scent Summer seminar is In the Heat of the Work. We know that you imagining and launching and leading social change is holy work. It's important work. We believe it is the work of the church, but it can be really hard work. And some of you might be in the heat of that social impact work already. And if that's you, maybe you're looking for, a word of encouragement. But others of you might have an inkling in your spirit, in your gut, to respond to a specific social need, a specific issue in your community. Um, but maybe you don't know where to begin. And so this year, our Scent Summer brings you a message of inspiration, of guidance and lived experience from leaders and practitioners who know what it's like when the work is hot. And so we hope that their stories and their lessons learned bring you a sense of affirmation to, lean into it, go and step out, or a sense of centering clarity, and certainly a sense of renewed encouragement to press on.
Friends, I want to invite us now to our time of preparing our hearts to hear from our keynote speaker today, who I will introduce. Daphne Frias is a climate justice advocate, a storyteller, and a disability rights leader whose work centers the lived experiences of communities most impacted by environmental harm. Her activism began in 2018 following the Parkland shooting and has since continued advocacy movements like the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, the New York Times Generation Climate Initiative, the March to End Fossil Fuels, and the UN Summit of the Future. Ms. Frias has been cited by the New York Times, AP News, the Stanford Social Innovation Review, and was named in 2025 as both Forbes 30 Under 30 as well as Times Magazine Latino Leader. Daphne's public activism, consulting, mentorship, and strategic advocacy are unwaveringly intersectional. Climate justice requires deep structural change that accounts for disability, social economic status, race, and health disparities. So join me in welcoming virtually Daphne Frias.
Darnell, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I am so honored to be here with all of you on the first day of summer. And I think that it is sort of the perfect metaphor of stepping into a new season and really owning who you are and what you can bring to create a better world for all of us. Today, as this introduction stated, I really am grounding my work in the power of storytelling and how we as movement builders, as friends, as leaders, can really use our voices and our stories to make the biggest impact possible to the people who need our help the most. And this is really how I ground my work as a climate organizer. When we're talking about the heat of the moment, there is no more urgent crisis really than the health of our planet and the health of our people, because when we think about all of the other issues that we are facing as humans, whether that be reproductive injustice, whether that be housing and economic inequality, whether that be immigration justice, etc., all of that is then amplified and further sort of divided when we think about the communities who are most impacted by the climate crisis. I always say that the health of our bodies and the health of our planet are inextricably linked, and we cannot care for one without caring for the other. And I bring that because it's also important to reflect and care about yourself as a community organizer. I think, especially as a freelance consultant, as someone who operates as their own boss, it's hard to be able to put on those brakes because no one else is doing it for you. You are the marketing director, you are the you're doing all the invoicing and payroll, you're the spokesperson, you're the one that everything is held accountable to, and you have to wear all of these different hats. And then sometimes the hat that falls off first is the one that carries yourself. And the message that I really want to bring here today is that in order to remember to pour into your own cup, it's about not fractioning yourself into multiple identities, but it's really about honing and owning all of who you are. I as part of my identity, I am very, very proud to be Latina, to be a Dominican American, to be disabled, to be a woman. All of those facets of my identity make me powerful and allow me to step in rooms and own who I am. But also remembering that in rooms of power, when it can feel daunting, when it can feel scary, when it can feel alarming, you are not stepping into these rooms alone, but you are stepping into these rooms with the power of your community and the power of your identity. I've been very fortunate in my work to be in some very, very high profile rooms with individuals like the Secretary General of the United Nations, world leaders, and I think it's very easy to diminish your voice amongst those who have powerful status. And in times like this, or even almost a decade into doing this work, I sometimes find my voice faltering. It's important to remember that we have the amazing honor as social entrepreneurs, as people who are trusted leaders in our community, to be a human megaphone. And this is something that I carry deeply and honorably. I get to let the stories of my people and my community flow through me and occupy rooms that we never thought possible. So when my voice is feeling quiet, sometimes I say, okay, I cannot speak today for Daphne, but what I can do is speak for all of those people who are not here. And that gives me the power and the courage to say, hey, I'm not going to miss this shot for all of the people who wish they could be here today. And that gives me the spark to keep going, because I know that when I go back home and I say I'm wholly accountable to my community, and I think that's a thread that can often be lost, especially we're living in such a technologically advanced time where to be a social entrepreneur, you kind of also have to be an influencer, and you have to balance social media, and you have to balance all of these nuances that from one day to the next are changing rapidly. And just when you thought you're getting on board, something changes, and you know, it goes on to the next direction, and you're just trying to catch up. But trying to stay grounded in that sort of ever moving treadmill of life, and the trends and the changes, what doesn't change is the people who need you and the people who look to you as their North Star. I often say that as human beings, one of the most powerful things that we can be are lighthouses. Lighthouses guide boats to shore and they bring them back home safely. And as humans, we can do the same thing. We can be the light to help guide people back to where they need to be and to guide them to new horizons and new shores. So in times where I am feeling unsure, I ask myself, where does my light need to be directed today? Whose boats do I need to bring to shore? And sometimes that's your own. And that's important to recognize that if you cannot find your way, I always say, if your own GPS is sort of a little wonky and you put the wrong directions in, if you can't get home, you can't bring anyone else home either. And I think there is so much deep value in knowing when you need help. And I think that as leaders, there's this misconception that can look like weakness. But I think it's actually one of our greatest strengths to say, I don't have to be the subject matter expert in everything. When I first started my advocacy work, whenever there was a major world crisis, I felt like I had to respond and put some very articulate statement out to my community and say, this is how I feel about X. But there were a lot of issues facing a lot of communities that I am not a part of and do not have the knowledge or the emotional connection to really fully articulate the impact of that moment. And by trying to respond, I was actually doing more harm than good, because I was speaking over the voices of the communities who were most impacted and not actually giving them the opportunity to use the voices themselves to speak about their own stories. So sometimes as a leader, the best thing you can do is use your platform as a stage to amplify others. And that has been really one of the greatest honors of my work as I transition from someone who began this work at 19, and I'm now 28, almost coming into, again, 10 years of this work. And now I'm looking at the next generation of young people, the next generation of 17, 18, 19-year-olds, and saying, I can give you my stage. I can share the spotlight with you. Because leadership is not about always being the one with the microphone, but it's about assessing who needs to be the one actually holding it. And it's also vitally important to understand that your lived experience is your expertise. This is something that I struggle with all the time. I'm constantly facing imposter syndrome. And I think people find this very hard to believe at times. When you read about my work and see the honors and accolades that I've been so fortunate to achieve, you wouldn't assume that I sometimes falter in my own confidence. But I think it is that humility of knowing that the wisdom that I carried yesterday, I may not always be granted that wisdom the next day. And that we must always be ready, willing, and able to learn and unlearn things that have gotten us to this point. And that to be called in isn't a moment of remorse or a moment to sort of look down upon yourself, but a moment to say, I am open and willing and able to offer reflection and growth. And there are so many times in this work where, especially working as a team, everyone has their sort of vision of how something should be executed. And you're trying to bring in sort of a homogenous view of all of these visions together. And having personalities, having egos, having visions, all of those things can be really complicated to balance all at once. And as a team leader, as someone who may be leading a group of people, they're looking at you for your vision, but they're also looking at you for your humility and saying, hey, I believe your vision is best. I don't have to be the one that has the stamp of approval at the end of the day. That trust goes so far because that is how you build new leaders. When you give someone the ability to have trust, to say, I see your vision and I see your power, that is how we continue to fertilize and blossom new soils of growth and togetherness and community. It's also vitally important to understand that when speaking about your own lived experience, no one can tell your story like you can tell your story. When I was first starting out this work as a teenager, I didn't have degrees behind my name. I didn't have a master's or a PhD, and I still don't. And walking into rooms of world leaders who have decades and decades and accolades after their name, I felt so small. And I said, well, why would anyone listen to me when all of these other important people are in the room? And I was doing myself such a disservice because I was devaluing the importance and the value of what I had to say and where I come from in my community. And I think by realizing that I already am the expert in my own life, no one can come in and say that is not true, because the truth is only your own. And owning that and knowing that has given me so much power to step into these rooms and say, yes, we're coming from all different walks of life, and we are all coming into these spaces with different ideologies. But at the end of the day, I can stand in the power of my voice in my community because I know where I've been and I also know where I'm going. It has helped me so much to understand that in order to be able to pick up such heavy responsibilities of protecting the planet and protecting our people, sometimes you also have to know when to put it down. And you don't have to see that as a failure. That is something I've struggled with many a time. I've also struggled with the misunderstanding, or not being able to sort of delineate where does the activist and advocate end, and where does Daphne, the person, the sister, the aunt, all of those other things also begin. And it's important to understand that those identities are not mutually exclusive to each other. You don't have to be one or the other on any given day. You can be all of them all at once. And that being a better friend, being a better sister, being a better aunt allows me to pour into being a better advocate for my people. If I can show up fully in those identities and show up for my family and the people that I care about, I can then show up better for my community in times of crisis. And that it is okay to experience joy, that on the flip side of some really, really emotionally heavy crises, whether you're working, as I said, on health or immigration or economic injustice, we're seeing a lot of deeply distressing stories and distressing realities that people are experiencing. And as a leader, you have to take that grief on, and it can be very heavy to hold that reality. And that's why it is important to pour into those other facets of your identity as well, because that helps you bring in the levity to be able to navigate that grief and that heaviness. And to sort of sum it up, I think what really has helped me in this work is knowing that sometimes we are building a future that we ourselves might not see. And that is okay, because the idea of the future is enough to be our North Star. And that is what guides us forward. That I have two little nieces, one that is 4-month-old and one that is 2.5. And I think about, I am building a world for them. I may not be able to see the fruits of my labor or to see a planet that is healthy and clean and green for as much as I desire it. But I know that all of the work now will impact the lives that they get to live in the future. And I think that is critically important. Intergenerational collaboration amongst the work of those who are doing social impact in our communities is critically and vitally important. I always say that as a community organizer, as a climate justice advocate, I stand on the shoulders of our Indigenous ancestors, those who have been fighting and protecting our planet for decades, those from the original climate movement in the early 60s and 70s who were ringing the alarms about the health of our planet for long before anybody believed them. I didn't come into this work with novel ideas or creating a pathway that I carved myself. I am walking a path that is very well known and very well traveled, and I can use that knowledge to grow my work. And in moments where I am needing guidance, that is where I can look back to my elders and say, together we rise forward and together we rise up. And I think that there's this notion of you must do it all on your own, but it's okay to lean back a little while and let your community and let the people who've come before you hold you. And I just want to wrap with a quick story. As part of my work, I also, I recently transitioned out of the founding role of my nonprofit called Box the Ballot. And we focus on youth voter engagement and getting young people civically engaged, voting in their communities, and being part of the electoral process, because we understand that our vote is our voice and that this is how we can make the biggest impact in our community. And we really focus on also providing voter education. So not just getting you to cast your ballot, but making an informed vote, knowing who your candidates are and knowing the important issues within your community. And something that we have been working on since the pandemic in 2020, because we understood that voting and the landscape of voting drastically changed during the pandemic, and many people were having to mail in their ballots because we were all social distancing and things of that nature. We created a Dropbox ballot system where a neighborhood could designate a Dropbox ballot captain, and that was someone who very quite literally had a little ballot box that we would give them, and people would come to that designated home or community center and drop their ballots. And most of our Dropbox ballot captains were under the age of 25, and this was their first time ever voting in any election. And what was really, really powerful about this initiative that we led was we saw that because we designated captains that were coming into their first voting cycle, we were also able to bring in their families who previously hadn't voted before. So we were not only activating these young people, but we were creating intergenerational household voting where because we had these young people in their homes, they were bringing their grandparents, they were bringing their aunts, they were bringing their uncles, and they were making being civically engaged a family affair. And because we were able to mobilize not just these young people, but their families and understand that one person is a touch point and a touchstone for a wider community. There is a network behind everyone. And I often say that one of the greatest joys of my life is to be a human LinkedIn. Whenever I see people or whenever I'm in a community, I think about the web of how we can all be connected to each other and the different resources and connections I can offer people. But the impact of our voting program was that we were able to collect over 30,000 ballots in under 8 weeks. And we were able to flip 11 counties, and we were able to most of our I believe it was 54% of our of all the ballots that we collected were first-time voters and intergenerational household voters where English was spoken as a second language. So we were targeting communities and giving a voice to individuals that were previously disenfranchised and not being able to use their voice to their greatest ability. And I think that I share this story because it reminds me that one person can have enough impact to change a massive community. We originally targeted these young people between 18 to 25, not knowing that it was going to open a whole entire door to generations of family members who would then benefit from our work. And that is the domino effect of how one person can do such amazing good. And I leave you with that story to say that if you're ever feeling small, if you're ever feeling like your work doesn't make an impact, one person can have more of an impact than even 10,000 people altogether. And I always say in my keynotes, people worry, oh, we had 100 signups, maybe only 10 people come. And I often say that I give the same energy to one person as I do to 10,000 people because you deserve that impact and you deserve that energy and you deserve someone to believe in you and see you wholeheartedly for who you are. So numbers don't necessarily always correlate to impact, but it's about the connection, the emotion, and the amount of human empathy that you're really willing to give to the people who you can connect to, and that makes the greatest impact going forward.
Thank you so much, Daphne, for just the humility and hope. You hold those both so gracefully, and there were so many things that I was like taking little notes on. Thank you for your time this evening. We're going to move into a brief portion of Q&A here. To dig a little deeper. So what recommendations, because you named earlier that sometimes we're trying to pull from this very homogenous group, but in reality we come from different contexts, different backgrounds, etc. What recommendations do you have for folks who are hoping and seeking to affect change in their communities, but who are maybe pushing up against or have to collaborate with others who are on the other side of the aisle, whether that's politically or otherwise, and to navigate those for good? What recommendations do you have?
Yeah, I think it's really about oftentimes when we're talking about ideologies and political beliefs or beliefs that divide us as individuals, they are often sort of the blindfolds that keep us from looking deeper into who people actually are, because we're just using that label as a blanket term to not really investigate and dig deeper. And this is something that I encounter all the time in my climate work. People will come up to me and say, but isn't the weather so nice? And I was like, yeah, but it's like 30 degrees hotter than it should be right now. And, that trickles down to so many impacts of people having higher electricity bills, people having less access to food. So when I often say, when the overt topic is something that is divisive, I boil it down to the smallest foundational pieces. So someone may sort of be dismissive on let's say the climate front, but I can come to them and say, hey, haven't you noticed that like our air quality is not that great, and we've been all struggling a little bit to breathe, and we've been struggling to get across the line with our electricity bills. Those electricity bills are going up.
Yeah.
And our groceries are also going up because our farmers are not being able to farm as predictably as possible. All of those things, food, housing security, and the way our health is impacted, those are the core foundations of how this issue, is impacting humans.
Right.
So it doesn't become a climate issue, it becomes a people issue. And I think that is what we must do for every topic. Sort of filter out the high level sort of jargon that scares people away. Those high level words, those political buzzwords may turn people off, right? But what people can connect to is how their pockets are hurting, how they're struggling emotionally, how they're seeing their community be impacted. And people will be like, hey, you know what? Yeah, the groceries are really, really high right now. And I used to be able to buy a bag of groceries for $50, and now that doesn't even get me milk and eggs and bread sometimes.
Right.
And, something that I've seen in my community is we've started opening up neighbor cooling centers where like one neighbor will have AC, and we'll call them AC parties. People will come and gather in one person's home, have snacks, and just like gather around the TV. Because you know what? At the end of the day, we're not like, oh my God, the climate crisis is raging on. We're like, no, we're trying to stay cool and safe.
Yeah.
And that is where we must boil it down to. We must boil it down to community. Say, hey, you may not agree with the overarching ideology, but I know that you are a kind-hearted, good person, and you want to keep your people safe. And I think that is critically important, that we remind people that when we are in catastrophe doesn't care about our labels. Catastrophe doesn't care about how we vote. Catastrophe doesn't care what language we speak.
Yeah.
It affects us all. And so when we can boil it down to those sort of foundational building blocks of we all experience this as a human, but also reminding people that the circumstance of your life can change one day to the next. I tell this to people all the time. You may not feel the effects of what's happening right now, but tomorrow you just might. And you want to be able to have that community outstretching their hand, just like you've done the same for them. And that brings us together as people. So really taking some time to sit and say, okay, I often say it's like playing with Legos as a kid. What are your first pieces of Legos that you're going to put down on the board? You can't build the skyscraper unless you have your foundation. And sometimes the skyscraper is the things that make people scared. People are scared of heights. Sometimes it's a little too tall for them up there. But if we can get them on the ground floor, if we can just get them in the door, that is enough. So finding what your foundational pieces are and using that to bring community together is really, really important.
That's good. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Daphne. I'm seeing the image of what you lifted up in your presentation around lighthouses, and that image begins to be profound in my mind, seeing ourselves as human lighthouses. So I'm curious, who have been some of your human lighthouses on your journey?
Yeah, I think that I think about some of my first lighthouses were my teachers, my English teacher and my social studies teacher in middle school and in high school. I often say that words are the building blocks of revolutions, and if you can understand and use words to affect emotion, affect people, affect institutions, you can change anything. I often think about you string words into sentences, sentences into paragraphs, and paragraphs into speeches that move people, that shape them, that impact them. And my mom, I think, especially because I come from a family where before my mom's generation and my generation, English was spoken as a second language. So as we were coming up, my mom was very cognizant about us being very on top of our speaking and our literacy skills so that we could effectively communicate who we were as people. Because unfortunately, we live in a time where everyone is judging a book by their cover, right? But by using your own words and your own voice, you can change the narrative of what's inside the book. And I was also very cognizant that as a disabled woman, as someone with a visible disability, people were going to perceive me and have their own preconceived notions about who I am and what I could accomplish. But the minute that they heard me speak and understand my story, that narrative changed. So having educators and having people in my life that allowed me to sort of wield the power of my own words, those were some of the greatest lighthouses in my life, because that's when I began to really understand, hey, if I can sort of let all of my emotions and my empathy be crafted into the words that I speak to people, and they can see me and hear me as a person, and not someone with an agenda or not someone with sort of a sales pitch, but just a person with a story that I have to share. And I think that that's one of my most effective strategies as a organizer. I'm not coming in trying to convince you. I never come into a room and saying, I want to leave here trying to make everyone believe that the climate crisis is real. I don't have an agenda going into any room ever. My only goal is to connect with you as a human being. And if I've left that room and I've done that, then my job is done, because I know that as you leave that room and go about your days and weeks and years, if I've made enough of an impact, it's going to stay on your spirit, and it's going to change who you are as a person. So my words are already doing the work of changing minds. I don't have to come with sort of, a sales pitch and say, here, believe me. My words do the work for me. Um, and I think the lighthouses in that way have also been, um, I think about the people who would be considered small but actually make a really big impact. I think about the the lady who sells ices on the corner of my block, and I see her every single morning when I go to the store and when I come back, and she's seen me at every major event. Every single time I go to the UN and I'm dressed up in like my nicest dress, and she has no idea where I'm going, but every single time she sees me and she says, I'm so proud of you. And because I know that I am going to see her every single day, and I can think back to seeing her at some of the most important moments, and she has become a landmark, a lighthouse for me. I think about the man who runs our 99-cent store on the corner from my house, and how many times I've run into his store because my shoe broke, or I needed water and I hadn't eaten all day because I was like running around doing work, and he like created a tab for me because he was like, girl, I know you're working hard. Here, just take the stuff that you need. And it's people that like don't have titles or accolades, but I wouldn't have made it here without them. So sometimes lighthouses don't have to look fancy or glamorous or big. They can be the most everyday people, but they are there when you need them the most. And I think that's what really matters.
That's beautiful. I actually have this image of like lots of little lighthouses together and like the light strengthening there. Um, what are some signs? What is some confirmation? Um, because one of the things that I really love about your work and your advocacy is that you are not only, cognizant of this, but you do such a good job of speaking to the intersectionality of so many issues within our world. Um, what are some signs or confirmation that your work is having impact, um, or your efforts are having impact when the systems can be so intersectional. And so because of that, really resistant to change or to transformation. So what might be some signs to look for that your work is taking root?
Yeah, I think that one of the best signs I can think of is when people can start realizing the systemic inequalities themselves. When someone can come up to you and say, hey, like, I was at the grocery store and I noticed that, like, last week the corn was $3 and this week it's like 6. And, like, I never thought about that before. Like, why are the prices so radically different one week to the next? And this actually happened to me last week. I was walking in our local grocery store, and this neighbor that has lived near us for years, she came up to me and she said, Daphne, I have to come tell you something. And I thought it was going to be, something very dramatic. And she said, do you know that the price of carrots have gone up by $1.75? And I was like, really? I had no idea. And she was like, and I thought about it because a week and a half ago, we were having really bad heat waves and we had a drought. And she said, and then I sat there and I thought about, like, oh, probably our farmers were really struggling because the weather was so inconsistent and they had to raise the prices. And
Hmm.
we, and I never thought about that before. And then, actually, the most impactful thing for me, she said, even though I'm struggling, I don't mind paying that extra $1.75 because I understand that we are all facing that impact together. It is a domino effect. And she said the farmers are struggling and we are struggling and the store owners are struggling. So that $1.75, that is a systemic community impact that is felt. And she said, it's gonna be okay because together we carry that burden of $1.75. And I was in the grocery store crying because
Yeah.
I was just so emotional to hear her say that. And I see stories and hear stories like that all the time where, you know, you talk to people and you run workshops and you do all of these things, and sometimes you just don't know if it lands, right? You can feel really good about it and feel like everything went great, but at the end of the day, you don't know. And then you see and hear these stories and you're like, oh, it actually did. It did really land. And then what was even more amazing was 2 days after I had the initial interaction, I saw another neighbor at the pharmacy, and this neighbor, she's only Spanish speaking, and she told me, "Hey, Elizabeth was complaining to me about the price of carrots, and she explained to me all about how the weather was impacting our food." And she said, "You know what? When I was living back in Dominican Republic, I used to work on the farm with my dad, and I used to tell him about this all the time." And she said, nobody knows this, but I used to work irrigation on my dad's farm, and I know all about how to run irrigation systems. So the next day, and this is a 75-year-old lady, she went to our community garden and said, "Hey, actually, I'm kind of really smart and I know all about these irrigation systems. I want to help you guys, like, fertilize and like grow your community garden." And this lady, she emigrated to the United States 30 years ago, um, worked very, very grueling jobs. And just because of this, like, one, like, domino effect, she was back doing something that, like, filled her heart and her spirit. And I just, like, she looked, I remember seeing her in the garden. I actually saw her before I left. And she looked so happy. She was, like, covered in dirt. And she was
Hmm.
like, I've never been happier. Like, she's like, I'm with the soil, I'm with the land. Um, and I share one last story. This I ran this pilot program a couple of months ago, where we were able to give some disbursements to disabled folks in our neighborhood who were struggling with groceries, and we shadowed some of our recipients of these grants, and because beyond giving them access to the funds, we also wanted to help support them in healthier eating habits, because we understand that communities of color have a higher disproportionate rate of health impacts like diabetes and hypertension. And if you live in food deserts where you don't have access to fresh and good quality groceries, those risks increase. So we also wanted to make sure that we were putting in healthy habits and systemic plans to help them live a better quality of life beyond just giving the financial impact. So I was shadowing one of our recipients, and what I noticed is all of the produce was on a higher up level. where this person who was a wheelchair user could not reach. The reason why these people weren't buying fresh produce wasn't because they couldn't afford it or wasn't because they didn't want to. They simply physically couldn't access it. And I said, wait, I never thought about that before. Because this was a grocery store that I didn't frequent. So I didn't know. I didn't know the layout of the store. And she said, yeah, the problem wasn't necessarily the money. And yes, while that's helpful, she said, if I don't feel empowered to shop, I'm not going to do it. So I actually went to the grocery store owner. His name's Michael. I said, Michael, hey, like, can we rearrange some sections in the produce area to bring some of these produce lower down? And he gave me this whole spiel about profit margins and visibility of produce and blah, blah, blah. And I said, Michael, I can confidently bet that your profit margins will actually increase because so many people who can't physically access these grocery items will now be purchasing and merchandising at your store. So he said, okay, very defiant. He was like, I'll try it for 3 days and I'll see. I said, okay, 3 days is better than none. So he did. He went and he reconfigured everything. And I went back to the store and he says, Daphne, do you know that my profit margins have increased by 75% just on lettuce? Just on lettuce. And I was sitting there, I said, this is not the time to be petty. This is not time to be self-serving. As much as I wanted to. And he said, that's so great to hear. I'm so happy. And he went and like rearranged the entire section to be accessible. And I think about the multitude of impact that has, right? Originally, he was being an asset to the system because the system has told him this is how you have to merchandise, this is how you have to profitize your business, this is how you have to do XYZ. Because I don't blame Michael. Michael's just trying to keep his store open. Michael's just trying to keep a roof over his head. He's trying to feed his family. He's trying to survive like we all are. But if we could show him that there's other ways outside of the structural inequities that we all experience and can better access and better financial return for all of us, then change doesn't have to be that scary. And I think that is such an important lesson to learn. Sometimes the system and the structural inequities that exist keep us quiet and keep us scared for a reason. Because they know that our unified power and our community is so loud that we can change all the systems that hold us down. And sometimes it just takes one person to say, hey, would you be willing to try? And to take that burden of fear. I think that's something I find such a privilege as a social organizer. I can say, it's okay to be scared. I'm going to hold that fear for you. Let me hold it so that you can be brave and try something different and try something new. And sometimes that's all you need, someone to say, it's okay to be scared. I'll catch you. And sometimes you find really, really awesome things to come out the other side. And it's so powerful to see. And that isn't to say that everything is going to have an amazing impact. And I want to really highlight that a lot of times you win or you win less than you lose. And it can be really hard to keep going because you're going to hit a lot more no's than you are yes. But it's about remembering that in the no's, there are a lot of little wins. It's not just a cumulative win. The overarching answer might be no, but what are all the steps you took to get there? And what are all the small little impacts you made along the way? Those are lessons learned to keep you going for the next time around. And I just think that in moments where I'm feeling really down, I hear those stories from my community and I was like, we're doing it. It's going to be okay. And one of my community members told me a lot of the work I do is also centered around public health and understanding how our environment impacts our health. And we, in my neighborhood, something that we've been fighting against for a very long time is a sewage plant that puts a lot of pollutants in our area, etc. And this one neighbor told me the other day that she actually went to the park and recorded her own air quality readings and submitted them to the local our local assembly person. And she said, you know what, I've sat in this park for 20 years. I would have never thought about the quality of our air. But she sat there and she said she was seeing all the kids playing in the playground. And she thought about their quality of life and like what they're experiencing and how they're being impacted by this. So she got, and it was like a $10 air quality monitor, not the most state of art thing, but it's something that made her feel purposeful and actionful. And I think that that is what's really important. It doesn't have to be grand. It doesn't have to be robust. It just has to be meaningful. And to her, it was. And she was able to find her voice in that and use that to make a bigger impact going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. So many rich stories. You are a storyteller, and we appreciate how you are able to bring in the stories of everyday people and how they are being impacted by the work that is happening in the world around them, especially through you as a lighthouse to them. So I want to close out with the question that I think many of us have to contend with, which is about burnout. So recognizing the reality of burnout. How do you sustain yourself in this work? As you named earlier the importance of caring for yourself in this work. How do you care for yourself?
Yeah, I think it's knowing how to say no with gracious boundaries. And I'm still figuring out what that means sometimes. But for me, it's about sort of filtering out the urgency of situations. As someone who is a leader, every issue is going to seem like the most pressing issue every single time it comes across your desk. And people are going to have a sense of desperation because their lives are being directly impacted. And it isn't for you to minimize their feelings or to minimize their reality, but to understand that sometimes if we move with too much urgency, we miss what is actually needing to be done because we don't actually get to serve people with clarity. When we serve with urgency, sometimes there is sort of, I call it that adrenaline fog. We're just trying to sort of solve the problem, but you don't actually take time to think and be like, okay, what is the most effective way to do this that creates a long-standing impact versus just a band-aid effect. And I've been at the other end of that, where I thought I did a really good job at solving an issue, but I realized I just band-aided it and left myself to sort of pick up the mess later on because I was just trying to help someone. And that isn't to fault your effort, but it's to say sometimes the urgency doesn't allow you to take a step back and really look at the full picture of what is needed to be done. So how can you manage that urgency with your community? First and foremost, that's a really important boundary. Say, I hear you, I see you. And I do this by working on sort of a tiered to-do list. When someone will come to me with a problem, let's say, Daphne, we're really struggling this week with helping folks cover their electricity bills. So, okay, cool. So the first thing can you give me a breakdown of the cost that we need to cover? Can you then connect me with folks that are, or can you sort of tier the folks in need by most urgent to least urgent? And then we can go from there. And we work in sort of tiered to-do list, because seeing an issue in its entirety, you're like, how am I supposed to tackle this? Where am I supposed to start? And you just kind of like go head first, and sometimes you drown. And sometimes there's no lifeboat either. And you're just like, how am I going to get out of this? So you need to give yourself a life vest, and you need to help yourself through that. And sometimes it's saying, okay, I only have 40% capacity right now, and being super, super honest with that, because 40% at your max is better than 10% when your tank is empty. That's not going to do anything. But if you can give your 40% while conserving the rest of your energy, and you're giving your most in that 40%, that is going to help so much more along the way. I also do things like I try really hard, and it's something I'm working on, to not answer emails on the weekends and to not answer emails after 6 p.m. And those are little switches and changes that preserve your autonomy. And it's that line that I was talking about of like a leader versus person. And it's like, okay, this is the time for me. And of course, there are going to be emergencies and there's going to be things of that nature. But having an overarching boundary of like, I've dedicated these hours to serving my people, my community. The rest of these hours are for me. And I think that it also is a leadership by example, where if people see that your boundaries are strong in that way, they will also allow their boundaries to be strong in that way too. And I was really scared to implement those boundaries in the beginning. I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm being so rude. Like, why am I not answering emails at 1 o'clock in the morning? Like people need me to answer them. And my mom always says, a crisis today is a crisis tomorrow. And she said, it'll be there and it's gonna be okay. And everything's gonna work out fine. And she's totally right. And I think that the more I've implemented my boundaries, my team and my community respect them, and they have sort of come on to the schedule on their own. And like they will now, one of my program managers, she even has like an app that like automatically shuts down all of our work phones after like 6 p.m. It's like, don't check your work phone, don't check your work stuff. And I think that that's like really important, but it takes that first person to be like, okay, this is the boundary that we're gonna set. And it's really hard and really scary, but it's so worth it, because I find myself like, because I'm not answering emails after 5 p.m. on Friday, on Monday, I'm so excited to be like, okay, what happened over the weekend? And people are like, you're crazy. Like, your weekend was your weekend. Like, why are you excited to see all your messages? And I was like, I want to know what my community's been up to. How can I serve my community? How can I serve my people? And it actually allows you to make work fun and impactful and full of joy again, because you're not constantly burning the candle at both ends, where it's not sustainable like that. And I think that um, it's about remembering first and foremost that there is joy in social impact work. I think a lot of times we think of all the hardship that we are helping communities through, and yes, that is true. But to help them through their greatest challenges is also a privilege of joy, and it makes me so happy to do this work. And you know, people people ask me all the time, you can't be that happy. And I'm like, no, like I actually love doing this work that I do, because I know that through all the hardship and every day, especially with climate work, every day you're turning on the news and you're like, oh my gosh, something awful is happening in relation to our planet. And it weighs heavy on your heart and it weighs heavy on your spirit. But I know that we are working together to make a difference, and that's what counts. So remembering that joy is not a mutually exclusive thing in this work, and you can pour in joy as much as you hold the grief. And a practice that I want to leave everyone with that has really helped me in my work, obviously because I work on climate, but every day I wake up and I ask myself, I sit on the ground trying to face the window if I can, and I ask myself, I close my eyes and say, how does the earth feel today? And I just like try to just take a few minutes to just like sit with the earth, sit with the vibrational fields of all the, you know, the continents and all of the oceans that are moving around, and say, I'm so 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 grateful to be a steward of this planet. How do you feel today, and how can I help you? And you'll be really really surprised what you hear back. And it's a beautiful time of reflection to ground yourself going into really crazy work. And I think it'll serve anyone, even if you're not working directly for a planet, but just taking a moment to say, we are serving our earth, whether we're working on climate, whether we're working on homelessness, whether we're working on housing, all of those things, we are serving our planet. So just taking that moment to be quiet with our earth is so powerful and so impactful. So I hope you will all try it.
Thank you so much, Daphne. That was beautiful. I am going to try that and I'm excited. to listen and see what she says. Thank you, Daphne Frias, for just a rich conversation, for your storytelling, for your centering, and absolutely for that hope that you have infused into myself, to us, and to our listeners who are, doing good work in the world. Thank you for those of you who are tuning in or are watching at any point. We're excited to have you here and connected to our programming. You can learn more about Daphne Frias's work via the links that'll be on screen here in just a moment.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
And if you want to connect with MBA's Social Entrepreneurship Program, please reach out. Our contact information will also be on a link on the screen after this. If you have an idea or some type of social enterprise that you have recently launched or a venture that you are currently thinking through, we're accepting applications for our 2027 SENT cohort, and our deadline for the application is August the 1st. Our cohort is a 1-year long program that offers strategic peer support, accompaniment, and learning to strengthen and develop those organizations and your idea that you're thinking through. So please join us. Consider applying. Take a look at our website, mbacares.org/SENT cohort.